Good morning, I'm Stéphane Fermigier, and I would like today to talk about public policies, how they can contribute to the sustainability of the European open source ecosystem and why they should. I'm a co-founder and a board member of APELL, an association that was founded last year. Its members are European Industry Association. Currently, 6 countries are represented, 5 in the EU plus the United Kingdom. And there is another additional member, Open Forum Europe. The current context in the EU is that there are many studies that show that free and open source software can be seen as an engine for economic growth and job creation. There is also an ongoing debate on digital sovereignty, and we strongly believe that free and open source software can play a huge part in this domain. And then I will try to discuss some existing policies before discussing some additional ones. First, the open source market in Europe is already quite big. In France, it's more than 5 billion euros per year. Same in Germany, same in the UK. And for the rest of Europe, it's about 10 billion euros per year. There were many economic studies. The most recent one, which is not yet published, but some preliminary results have been discussed already, is that free and open source software contribute a lot to the European economy. Since we want to discuss digital sovereignty, we need a definition, and I'm using the one that's provided by the French Ministry of Defense. In this context, digital sovereignty is defined as a strategic autonomy. It doesn't mean that a country or the European Union should try to do everything internally, but it should always try to preserve an autonomous capacity for assessment, decision, and action in the digital space. According to the Commission, to last year's plan on open source that was published by the Commission, the open source model will have an impact on Europe's digital autonomy. And this year, with CNLL, the French National Association of Open Source Businesses, we did a large survey of our members, and more than 90% of these company leaders believe that digital sovereignty is a very important priority for both economic and the democratic future of France and Europe. But only 1/3 of the respondents believe that France is implementing right now the right open source industrial strategy to regain digital sovereignty. Almost 90% of the respondents believe that the key principles of open source can help preserve the digital sovereignty of France and Europe. And according to the same study, digital sovereignty can be a driver for new businesses. You have the figures on the slide. New customers that recognize that open source is an important factor for sovereignty, but it's still a bit hard to explain. And so our opinion is that the European Union, the member states, and the regions must all define and implement open source industrial strategies. So now a sample of existing policies across the EU. The most important document at this point is the communication by the European Commission that was launched last year, and which aimed to develop software solutions and take into account the openness, sharing, and reuse that are specific to open source. But after reading carefully the communication, there are a lot of very interesting points, but what we found lacking is that there is absolutely no mention of a real economic policy that would underline this open source strategy for Europe. In France, there have been some open source strategies for at least 10 years. One of the most important first occurrences were the Circulaire Hérault in 2012, that would argue to the proper use of free software in the public administration. The main argument that were considered at the time were only tactical considerations: lower cost, flexibility, negotiation leverage with software vendor, but no mention of strategic autonomy or similar concept. The Loi République Numérique, 4 years later, was a huge step forward. because the word control, durability, and independence of the public services administration systems is written in the law, and independence, as we've already discussed, is almost or very closely related to digital sovereignty. And most important point for the open source community is that this law says that the public administration should encourage the use of free software and open standards. More recently, a new circular by Prime Minister Jean Castex in April created a new team in the administration called Mission Logiciel Libre, or an open source, which is quite related to the concept of open source program office, with a three-pronged action plan to help the public administration publish its own source code under open source licenses, to make better use of open source software in the administration, and to use open source to make the administration more attractive to digital talent. But what's lacking for this three-part plan is, once again, an economic policy. Let's look a bit at Germany. Quite recently, a Center for Digital Sovereignty was established within the public administration, and it's quite clear that the initial mission for this center is the promotion of open source software in the public administration. So this is the strongest argument that we've seen so far for linking the two concepts of digital sovereignty on one end and open source software promotion on the other end. There is a strategy for German government cloud, which doesn't mention actually open source, but mentions the use of open standards and distributed systems. This is related to open source, obviously, but it's not exactly the same. And we've been told that 3 lenders have explicit preference for free and open source software in their public procurement process. 2 other examples. Italy passed a law 9 years ago that did mandate the use of open source software for every project in the public administration, except for a few exceptions. But what happened is that the exception became the rule, and at the moment, this law had 0 impact, and the public administration is mostly now a Microsoft shop. And in Sweden, the Agency for Digital Government has published a policy that says that software that is developed or procured by the agency shall be, in the normal case, published as open source. So what can be done now? And how do we achieve this? First, existing regulation, whether they encourage or say that open source should be preferred, or if there should be some obligation to use free and open source in the public administration, these regulations are not currently enforced or not sufficiently enforced. So they need to be enforced, and if this regulation don't exist, that new regulation similar to the one we've discussed should be implemented. And the second point is that the free and open source need more promotion. Not just foundations or individual hackers or open source developers within the public administration, but also the business sector. And last, there is a need for financing, both for innovation work and for maintenance work. So here is a 3-part plan. First part is to double down on open source program offices. We need open source program offices or Mission Logiciel Libre everywhere. At the state level, at the commission level, at the region level, at various ministries level, and all these OSPOs should work together and try to exchange information and case studies, etc., etc. Secondly, these OSPOs should not just have an internal activity within the public administration, but also engage with the businesses. That should be in their mission. Currently, at least in France or in the European Commission, it's not explicitly written. And they should have KPIs. And one of the KPIs should be the proportion of free and open source software that's actually used in the whole of IT purchases made by the public administration. So first, we need a tool in every ministry, in every large public administration, in every member state, or at the EU institution level, in order to be able to measure these indicators. And then we should be able to measure its progression. The second part is financing. How do we finance open source work? There's one thing. There are some instruments to finance R&D and innovation, like Horizon Europe. But what's the part of Horizon Europe that goes to open source software, and which part doesn't go? We don't know, and this part should be increased. Then there is the question of contractualization between the public administration and the free and open source SMEs that actually produce the open source software that are used by the public administration. Sometimes there are large support contracts between a large administration and a large IT company. This contract, sometimes it works, but sometimes the large IT company takes all the value from this contract, and there is no value left for the company that actually create and maintain the software that are the object of this contract. This needs to be monitored, and there should be some rules and regulation that will help the system run more smoothly. And then for infrastructure software, when there are no companies actually working on the software, we should develop explicit funding scheme in order to maintain these common goods. The last part of our strategic plan is to keep the playing field level for free and open source software, and especially for free and open source software companies. The public administration should promote free and open source software. Sometimes there are existing schemes like La French Tech in France to promote the digital technologies companies in France, but at this point, and the scheme has been going on for more than 5 years now, there hasn't been any specific actions around free and open source software. There is a strong issue around education, so free and open source software concepts should be taught to pupils in the education system whenever it's relevant. And there is also need for more developers or software engineers that are trained with the concept of free and open source software. There are several legal issues around open source, and with the proper legal framework, we will ensure that open source software can still thrive. For instance, with the right interoperability requirement, with the right public procurement regulation. If we don't allow software patents in Europe, if with regulations around digital privacy, like the GDPR, all of these regulations will help level the playing field, and sometimes help the free and open source software companies, which are better aligned with some of these regulations. And this regulation should also be used to keep the big tech companies at bay. Sometimes they are in a position of monopoly, and sometimes they will abuse this monopoly position. And of course, in this case, they should be prosecuted, as they have been already in the past. What are our current plans at APELL? So there will be a joint publication in the next weeks where we'll expose this vision in more details and this proposition. Some national organizations like CNLL and OSBA have been doing this for quite some time. There will be some events, at least a first one with EU representative, and we hope that this free and open source idea will be one of the items on the French presidency's agenda next year. So that's all for today. There are some a few references, and I don't know if there is time for questions. Thank you very much.